was cancelled after 50 episodes. Not long after, many of the Weavers' Green team started making another rural soap, which lasted a little bit longer, a small production known as Emmerdale Farm. Kate Pratt, ITV News, Hayden and Norfolk.
So joining us in the studio is Tim Snelson from the University of East Anglia, who carried out this research. So Tim, first question, what was it that attracted you to Weavers' Green? Why did you start this research?
Okay, so I first encountered the programme when I was doing some research for a conference about Anglia television in 2008, and in watching a few episodes to try and get a flavour of the show and to find out about this soap that was made in the 60s, I sort of got a bit hooked on the storytelling, but also, you know, to realise that this was such a prestigious production. Partly, you know, lots of big stars were involved. You know, before Wendy Richards was a big soap star, people like Wendy Richards, Dennis Waterman, even Susan George. You know, lots of these big British stars were involved. But also, lots of money was thrown at this show, and it is a really sort of lavish, prestigious sort of production in the way that it feels and looks. So I suppose it was interesting to think, you know, why this show, why this moment, and why did it ultimately fail?
Why did it fail?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. At the time, a lot of people within Anglia, but also in you know, in trade presses and other places, suggested that it was because of scheduling. So although it had a very popular weekday slot, the slot that was at the weekend, across the different ITV regions, some places it was on Saturday, I was on Sunday, the time slot moved around, and that this didn't allow it to get a regular viewership. And partly the suggestions that might have been a bit political, that actually potentially there was the bigger ITV regions, what were called the Big Four at the time, that actually they didn't necessarily, you know, want Anglia and want this show to get a foothold in the prime time schedule. So there is sort of talk of it being a bit political.
And looking at it as a series, how much of a precursor to the soap operas that we know today was it?
Well, I mean, it is interesting. Again, I mean, in terms of, it wasn't discussed as a soap opera at the time. It was, you know, the term soap wasn't used that much anyway at that time, but it was certainly positioned as being this lavish production. It was seen more as a TV version of The Archers than maybe a Norfolk version of Coronation Street. So it sort of it was so innovative, and so much money was spent, particularly on the location shooting on places like Hayden, in Norwich, around the Broads, that actually it's sort of, you know, some of that has been incorporated into contemporary soaps, but it was quite sort of original and innovative at the time for doing that.
So in the research you've done, you've actually spoken to some of the people that were in the show, and you've sort of had a good look at the history of it, haven't you?
Yeah, and certainly some of the people who were involved in the production of the show and these sorts of things. So, I mean, and some of those have talked about you know, the show and potentially the scheduling issues. But it's also interesting to speak to them about the ways in which the show, you know, attempted to attract a national audience, partly by introducing some of these stories that involved, you know, that were contemporary. And, you know, one of the most interesting characters is Celia Toms, who's a vet's wife, who moves, she's this sort of swinging 60s woman who moves from Knightsbridge to the little village of Norfolk's Weavers' Green. And, you know, the problems that she has maybe fitting in terms of, you know, bringing these liberal ideas, these emergent sort of feminist ideas to bear on the town is, you know, that's sort of a way in which maybe there was an attempt to appeal to a national audience as well.
Very interesting, and of course it's still got its appeal now because so many people still remember it. We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, but Tim Snelson, many thanks indeed for coming in.
Thank you.
Well, we had a bright and sunny